Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 6th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. So Jesus said to them, "Come away to a deserted place, all by yourselves, and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And when they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves, now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Later, when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So, what do you want to talk about? I mean, this feels like incredibly bad timing on my part. Spending a whole week traveling and attending this amazing yet quite busy and intense week of the youth gathering, arriving home last evening and immediately turning around into this. I mean, nothing against you all here. I'm just assuming that you'd like me to attempt to try and say something helpful and intelligent. I know there's a first time for everything. Something that would feed your soul as well. But after a week of being fed and filled, I struggled with what I could offer back to you. And I don't necessarily mean being fed like we were with gumbo, and jambalaya, and crawfish etouffee, and po' boys, and shrimp and grits, and collard greens, and red beans and rice, and beignets, and pralines, and bread pudding. I'm getting ahead of myself. We ate really good this week, I have to say. But what I really mean is that we were fed by powerful speakers and stories. We were fed by engaging faith in new ways and being immersed in the area's culture and making new friends and reconnecting with old friends. We were filled to overflowing with all of these things. Events like this are often described as trying to drink from a fire hydrant. And now that we're back, we need some time to digest, to process, to reflect, to make meaning of all the things that we heard and learned, and let it all sink into our beings. And quite frankly, I guess what we really need is rest. It's fitting, then, what we heard about Jesus and his disciples in today's gospel story, right? So as Mark says, the apostles gathered around Jesus, and when they came back, they told him all that they had done and taught while they were out. So Jesus says to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." Because so many people were coming and going, they had no leisure even to sit and eat. So Jesus knows all the things that these disciples have done. He's heard about all of this. Maybe he's even witnessed some of the things they've done. And Jesus knows the toll that it takes on someone who does all of this work. So he invites them to come away and rest. Well done, faithful servant. But that doesn't even stop the people, right, does it? So Mark says they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves, but so many other people saw them going there, and they recognized Jesus and the disciples, and all these people hurried on foot from all the towns, and they arrived ahead of them. And as Jesus and the disciples went ashore, they saw this great crowd, but Jesus had compassion on them still, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Even as the disciples were trying to get some rest, even as Jesus himself probably was looking for some time away from the crowds and had this chance to process what the disciples have been through, even though they showed up there and wanted to be alone, when the crowds followed them and showed up with them, Jesus still cared for them. He didn't turn to them and say, can we just get like 10 minutes apart, or maybe just a few hours to ourselves? Or he didn't look at the crowd and say, we'll be back in a day or two, come back then. Jesus had compassion on these crowds, and he offered them the healing that can only come from God. If you're paying attention there in today's reading, there's a chunk of Mark's gospel that is missing in the middle of it. And there are two big stories that we skipped over. One was the feeding of the 5,000, because we're going to hear that next week. Then the other was the story of when Jesus walks on the water out toward the disciples who were in a boat, in a way to help the disciples understand more about who he is. But I think we skip these stories today to get to this next little section, which almost feels like a side note in Mark's gospel, that tells us that after Jesus did all of these things, after he tried to get away and yet still showed compassion on the crowds, after he showed this compassion and feeding 5,000 and scaring the heck out of the disciples on the boat, even after all of that, Jesus continues to give of himself. He's bombarded by the crowds. Once again, they recognize him and they go and bring all the sick people they can find to him. And yet Jesus still offers healing to any who will come to him and any who are brought to him. Because that is who Jesus was created to be for this world. As I said in the announcements, I can't really speak to much of what happened at Bible camp. I don't know the theme. I don't know the stories that were told. I'm hoping to catch up with that soon. But I can tell you a little bit about the youth gathering, though I won't spoil it all because I know some of our youth would like to share their stories with you. But the theme for this past week for our youth gathering was created to be. And so in Psalm 139, there are two verses that say, "For it was you, O God, who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well." So all this week, we were encouraged to give thanks for who we are created to be, and to give thanks to God for creating us to be who we are, and to be bold in who we are. We were encouraged over those 5 days in knowing that we have been created to be brave, created to be authentic, created to be free, created to be disruptive, and created to be disciples. So just like the disciples who were sent out by Jesus to share the good news, to teach about God's love, and to show the world the wholeness that comes through our Creator, we too, like those disciples, are meant to be brave in our calling. God has created us to be brave. God created us to step out of our comfort zones, like showing up in an unknown city at an unknown arena with 16,000 of your newest yet still unknown new best friends for a week of being challenged and growing. Being brave is proclaiming and acting out God's love in a world that's not ready to receive that love and maybe often doesn't want to receive that love. God created us to be authentic. In the gospel, Jesus and his disciples openly admitted their human need for rest and renewal, and yet at the same time, Jesus turned around and jumped right back into the embodiment of offering God's healing and wholeness to all who were in need. Our speaker that night said that being authentic means that we are anyways people. Anyways people. Because when the world says there's no hope, we are to love anyways. When the world says that who you are isn't right, we are meant to live into our identity anyways. When the world is filled with ugliness and sorrow, we are to shine beauty and life into that world anyways. God created us to be free. The crowds in today's gospel story, they did not hesitate to bring the sick and the hurt and the suffering among them to Jesus in the hope that he would heal them. They were free. They felt free enough to do such a thing. And we too should know that through God who created us to be, and through what Jesus has done for us, we also are free to live boldly and to be free to be transformed by this gospel message. The fourth night, we learned about how we were created to be disruptive. And if you've ever met a high schooler, I don't think they're here. Oh, some are. If you've ever met a high schooler, you probably know what it means for someone to be disruptive. Actually, if you've never met another human being, you know that we all know what it means for someone to be disruptive. And most of the time, being disruptive is not necessarily a good thing, but think about the ways that Jesus came into this world to disrupt the things around us. To disrupt the world's standards, to disrupt the injustices that he witnessed. We know the stories. The authorities did not like him being disruptive. That's why they put him to death on a cross. But if we are called to be followers of Jesus, then we know that God has called us to also be disruptive. To call out the evil that we see around us. To challenge unjust rules that keep some people oppressed and others receiving unfair privilege. To stand up to those who get in the way of someone else's wholeness and well-being. And wrapping all of that up, we were told and shown how God has created us to be disciples. Just as Jesus has taught his disciples to be sent out as his followers and teach the things he's taught them and do the things he's shown them, we too are called to go as followers of Jesus and embody who he is and what he's done. We are called to be disciples who are brave and authentic and free and disruptive. So this is a lot to take in, obviously. It's a lot to remember and know about who we are, who we've created to be, and it's a lot to know how we are called in that same way to go and live in this world. But we can be assured that God has created us to be all of those things. We already are. And we can be assured that God never wearies of us reaching out for healing and wholeness and peace in our times of need. God has created us to be that way. God has created the world to be that way. And for that, I say, thanks be to God.